At some unnatural hour of the morning the dairyman had caused the yawning chimney corner to be whitened, and the brick hearth reddened, and a blazing yellow damask blower to be hung across the arch, in place of the old grimy blue cotton one with a black sprig pattern, which had formerly done duty here. This renovated aspect of what was the focus indeed of the room on a dull winter morning threw a smiling demeanour over the whole apartment. "I was determined to do summat in honour on't," said the dairyman, "and as you wouldn't hear of my getting a rattling good randy with fiddles and bass viols complete, as we should have done in old times, this was all I could think of as a noiseless thing." Tess's friends lived so far off that none could conveniently have been present at the ceremony, even had any been asked. But as a fact nobody was invited from Marlott. As for Angel's family, he had written and duly informed them of the time, and assured them that he would be glad to see one at least of them here for the day, if he would like to come. His brothers had not replied at all, seeming to be indignant with him, while his father and mother had written a rather sad letter, deploring his precipitancy in rushing into marriage, but making the best of the matter by saying that, though a dairywoman was the last daughter-in-law they could have expected, their son had arrived at an age at which he might be supposed to be the best judge. This coolness in his relations distressed Clare less than it would have done had he been without the grand card with which he meant to surprise them ere long. To produce Tess, fresh from the dairy as a d'Urberville and a lady, he had felt to be temerarious and risky. Hence he had concealed her lineage until such times as, familiarized with worldly ways by a few months' travel and reading with him, he could take her on a visit to his parents and impart the knowledge while triumphantly producing her as worthy of such an ancient line. It was a pretty lover's dream, if no more. Perhaps Tess's lineage had more value for himself than for anybody in the world besides. Her perception that Angel's bearing towards her still remained in no whit altered by her own communication rendered Tess guiltily doubtful if he could have received it. She rose from breakfast before he had finished, and hastened upstairs. It had occurred to her to look once more into the queer gaunt room which had been Clare's den, or rather eyrie, for so long, and climbing the ladder she stood at the open door of the apartment, regarding and pondering. She stooped to the threshold of the doorway, where she had pushed in the note 2 or 3 days earlier in such excitement. The carpet reached close to the sill, and under the edge of the carpet she discerned the faint white margin of the envelope containing her letter to him, which he obviously had never seen, owing to her having in her haste thrust it beneath the carpet as well as beneath the door. With a feeling of faintness she withdrew the letter. There it was, sealed up just as it had left her hands. The mountain had not been removed. She could not let him read it now, the house being in full bustle of preparation, and descending to her own room she destroyed the letter there. She was so pale when he saw her again that he felt quite anxious. The incident of the misplaced letter she had jumped at as if it prevented a confession, but she knew in her conscience that it need not. There was still time. Yet everything was in a stir. There was coming and going. All had to dress, the dairyman and Mrs. Crick having been asked to accompany them as witnesses, and reflection or deliberate talk was well nigh impossible. The only minute Tess could get to be alone with Clare was when they met upon the landing. "I'm so anxious to talk to you. I want to confess all my faults and blunders," she said with affected lightness. "No, no, we can't have any faults talked of. You must be deemed perfect to-day, at least, my sweet," he cried. "We shall have plenty of time hereafter, I hope, to talk over our failings. I will confess mine at the same time. But it would be better for me to do it now, I think, so that you could not say, "Well, my quixotic one, you shall tell me everything. Say, as soon as we are settled in our lodging, not now. I too will tell you my faults then. But do not let us spoil the day with them. They will be excellent matter for a dull time." "Then you don't wish me to, dearest?" "I do not, Tessie, really." The hurry of dressing and starting left no time for more than this. Those words of his seemed to reassure her on further reflection. She was whirled onward through the next couple of critical hours by the mastering tide of her devotion to him, which closed up further meditation. Her one desire, so long resisted, to make herself his, to call him her lord, her own, then, if necessary, to die, had at last lifted her up from her plodding, reflective pathway. In dressing she moved about in a mental cloud of many-coloured idealities which eclipsed all sinister contingencies by its brightness. The church was a long way off, and they were obliged to drive, particularly as it was winter. A close carriage was ordered from a wayside inn, a vehicle that had been kept there ever since the old days of post-chaise travelling. It had stout wheel spokes and heavy felloes, a great curved bed, immense straps and springs, and a pole like a battering-ram. The postillion was a venerable boy of 60, a martyr to rheumatic gout, the result of excessive exposure in youth, counteracted by strong liquors, who had stood at inn-doors doing nothing for the whole 25 years that had elapsed since he had no longer been required to ride professionally, as if expecting the old times to come back again. He had a permanent running wound on the outside of his right leg, originated by the constant bruisings of aristocratic carriage poles during the many years that he had been in regular employ at the King's Arms, Casterbridge. Inside this cumbrous and creaking structure, and behind this decayed conductor, the partie carrée took their seats, the bride and bridegroom, and Mr. and Mrs. Crick. Angel would have liked one at least of his brothers to be present as groomsman, but their silence after his gentle hint to that effect by letter had signified that they did not care to come. They disapproved the marriage, and could not be expected to countenance it. Perhaps it was as well that they could not be present. They were not worldly young fellows, but fraternizing with dairy folk would have struck unpleasantly upon their biased niceness, apart from their views of the match. Upheld by the momentum of the time, Tess knew nothing of this, did not see anything, did not know the road they were taking to the church. She knew that Angel was close to her. All the rest was a luminous mist. She was a sort of celestial person who owed her being to poetry, one of those classical divinities Clare was accustomed to talk to her about when they took their walks together. The marriage being by licence, there were only a dozen or so of people in the church. Had there been 1,000, they would have produced no more effect upon her. They were at stellar distances from her present world. In the ecstatic solemnity with which she swore her faith to him, the ordinary sensibilities of sex seemed a flippancy. At a pause in the service, while they were kneeling together, she unconsciously inclined herself towards him, so that her shoulder touched his arm. She had been frightened by a passing thought, and the movement had been automatic, to assure herself that he was really there, and to fortify her belief that his fidelity would be proof against all things.